Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. This video is about Pete Buttigieg, who's just declared that he's seeking the Democratic nomination for the forthcoming presidential election. Well, it's already a packed field, being hotly contested by up to 20 contenders, which tells you something about the Democratic Party's optimism for next year's presidential election. So, Pete Buttigieg has got one of the trickiest names to pronounce in American politics, and he's wisely tolerant about people mispronouncing it, which is the right thing to do if you have a name which doesn't trip off the tongue for Anglophones, because the first syllable looks like but. Anyhow, it's a Maltese name, since he's Maltese on his father's side, and no doubt he's got touching tales about his father realizing the American dream. So, Mr. Buttigieg, he's happy to declare that he's homosexual, and it was difficult for him to come out despite having very liberal parents, moving in very intellectual circles where his orientation was completely accepted. It strikes me as a gay JFK, and he's created quite some noise in the blogosphere, and people have been calling in various shows saying they think that he's really something. Anyway, his declaration speech was quite personal and emotive. That's American style. It is about electing him as an individual. It's not just about electing people to a legislature. So yeah, it's right that it's about him as much as it is about policies and so on, because people have to choose him believing he has the judgment and the temperament for the highest office in the land. Anyhow, I'm just worried that his orientation will be a disadvantage for him. I wouldn't hesitate to vote for a homosexual man or woman, but some people would. And if that makes a difference to as much as 1% of the voters to either vote against him or just not vote at all, when they otherwise would have voted for the Democrats, that could mean the difference between winning and losing the election. Sometimes these things have been won by a hair's breadth. Anyhow, so he's certainly a very clever gentleman. Everybody knows he went to Harvard. He won the Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University, where he got a first-class degree. So he knows an awful lot about politics, which is what he primarily studied in both places. Being too educated could be a disadvantage for him. In American politics, you mustn't come across as too cerebral, like Barack Obama, Professor Obama, I suppose I should call him. He had to play down his academic credentials and not seem a towering intellectual, because that would have rubbed many people up the wrong way. And I suppose the Republicans are quite smart at this, or quite dumb enough, naturally, but at least managed to conceal their intelligence a lot of the time, because it would not play well with a lot of their blue-collar voters. So Mayor Buttigieg, he's mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He served in the US Navy. The thing is, military experience doesn't appear to be any advantage in standing for the presidency. Because, okay, look back to previous presidential elections. Obama versus John McCain, and Obama won. Well, okay, Mitt Romney didn't have any. Or you look back to George W. Bush versus John Kerry. John Kerry volunteered for Vietnam. Bush was in the Texas Air National Guard. Or Bush against Al Gore, who went to Vietnam and Bush didn't, and so on. I go back to 96, Clinton against Bob Dole, who was in the Second World War, and Bill Clinton won. Bill Clinton against George H.W. Bush, who was in the Second World War. Likewise, Bill Clinton won. So since then, it's the candidate with less military experience, or indeed none, who did better. So I don't think it's going to swing it. But perhaps the losing candidate, if he hadn't had military experience, might have done even worse. So clearly, wearing America's uniform is not the decisive factor. But Mayor Buttigieg, he's very engaging. He's not too wordy, doesn't come across as too conceited. He does talk up his accomplishments, but that's American style. So he gets the tone just right. He's personable, unthreatening, but to some people that come across as feeble. He doesn't try to do macho. It's like Trump must have this bottomless inferiority complex, which compels him to always try to menace other people and be constantly bragging about his accomplishments while lying about them. So Mr. Buttigieg, he's light on policy detail, which is probably the right thing to do at this stage. So he's into expediency. Well, healthcare, he wouldn't commit to Medicare for all. He's pragmatic, he's agnostic on this. not painting himself into a corner with policy proposals which can be scrutinised later. Concentrate on trying to get the nomination first and work it out later. Look how vague Trump's policies were. His platform really hadn't thought it through, and yet he won. So being too precise, it would be a disadvantage. You make yourself a hostage to fortune. People can say this and that about exactly your prescriptions. Anyhow, a lot of it's down to Congress. The president doesn't need to have precise policies on it. He can have an agenda, or she can have an agenda, which they can try and get through, but ultimately it's not up to them on things like that. I realise in foreign policy, the president does have broader prerogatives. So there are no surprising positions coming out from the Buttigieg campaign. And we recognise that climate change is real and doesn't have that much of a detailed plan of how to tackle this very pressing issue. And he recognised that slavery is obviously atrocious, something that Republicans don't say so vehemently, but he hasn't committed himself to an apology. And as for reparations, says he hasn't seen a workable scheme. Obviously, there are other things that can be done, but saying, absolutely, there's an issue we need to address. So perhaps he's a bit slippery on this. It seems to me it's constructive ambiguity. That's the unifying thread to all his policy statements. Don't spell out exactly what you're going to do. Don't tie yourself down. Make noises in the general direction of something that Democrats are gonna like. For some people, he's not left-leaning enough. Anyway, he's telegenic, and I think Lawrence Rees is the one who told the public this. I don't know where he got it from. That likability has been found to be the most important factor in getting somebody elected. Don't know quite why people think Trump's likable, but there we are. That was the most important factor until not so long ago. Politics aside, is this a person you'd warm to? So the contrast to Donald Trump could scarcely be starker. Mayor Buttigieg is half Trump's age, but far more mature. He's tranquil yet energetic. He's comfortable in his own skin. And he's been successful, being a mayor of a medium-sized town for just 8 years. And it's certainly very approachable. He's got the common touch. And, his feet are very firmly on the ground. He doesn't seem to suffer from any of the debilities that Trump suffers, or any of the complexes, the egomania that afflict Trump. So there are some obstacles that Mayor Buttigieg has to encounter. Name recognition. Now, I follow the American political scene quite closely, especially considering I'm not an American. And I'd never heard of this man till a few weeks ago. Familiarity bias helps a lot in politics. Everybody knew who Trump was. I've only been to the United States a few times, and I'd known who he was since probably the early 90s. Trump missed no opportunity to appear on television. So familiarity breeds respect. If people know something, they're more likely to like it, more likely to vote for it. So picture the presidential debates, him going head-to-head and Donald Trump. So Donald Trump could be making a fool of himself, could be scraping the gutter, being very insulting, and Buttigieg could come across as much better, being wise, mature, rising above the fray, being statesmanlike without coming across as false, and just dealing with the policies, speaking to ordinary people, how he sympathizes with them, how he wants to solve their problem. And that could make a jarring contrast with Trump. Trump could come across as looking as much worse, so arrogant, so hubristic, so spiteful, that could play into Buttigieg's hands. Anyway, there's a very long way to go. There are about a dozen declared candidates and several who are publicly mulling it over. So at the moment, Buttigieg appears to be a front runner, but this is very early doors. The nomination won't be for over a year, so he could well fall by the wayside because he's just declared that yes, there's a buzz of media interest in him. So it's by no means a foregone conclusion. He's one of the more likely ones. On the outside, he would seem to be unlikely because you should have been a governor or a senator or something like that beforehand, and Buttigieg was not known on a national scale till very recently. But the rules are always changing, and as everybody knows, that Trump has torn up the rule book, which means that someone who would have been considered a rank outsider, Buttigieg is in with a chance. As much as 10 years ago, the idea of a gay president would have been unthinkable, but perhaps America is ready for this next step to break this last glass ceiling for those with same-sex orientation.